Google was set up by a couple of engineers who tried to make a place that's a wonderful place for engineers to work. In some agile cultures, there's a resistance to planning. We don't plan and we don't do deadlines. If you don't have a strategy, you don't know what you're trying to achieve, it's really hard to set an OKR. I actually use OKRs as a tool to cause people to realize that what they need to do about the strategy. The role of management is really to ensure that we get the right pieces of information and the right decisions and that those decisions happen. I don't think the OKRs actually work as a tool to enforce, but they do work as a tool to highlight and structure things. The ways to take learnings from companies like Amazon and Google is not to duplicate the processes, because that doesn't always work. When you're working with the executive teams of the startups that I work with, usually they don't have a strategy. You start to get that team really engaged in understanding how this business works, which then means that I can come up with a strategy much better and my OKRs much better. I've learned ways of sort of provoking the difficult decisions and then the difficult questions about the strategy to cause clarity around the strategy before we go into the OKR setting process.
Hi, and welcome everyone to another episode of the Agile Insights Conversation series. Today I have Richard Russell as my guest. Richard is another one of those people that I met on LinkedIn because we have a shared interest in many topics we discuss. We're not always on the same page, but I think there is a lot of mutual respect, and I'm very happy to have Richard with us today. And as usual, I'll hand over the stage first to Richard so that he can do a proper introduction of himself before we then dive into some of the topics that we will based on his experience working in various companies. So Richard, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. I'll hand over the stage to you.
Thanks, Sohrab. Basically by way of introduction, I have a technical background. I was a software developer originally, and I very rapidly realized that my skills and interests lie more in people than in technology. And so I ended up doing various things. I was at Deutsche Bank about 20 years ago, doing foreign exchange trading platform and so on. I ended up at Google for 6 years in London. You may hear from the accent, I'm Australian, but I ended up in London for 10 years. And I worked for Google for 6 years on various products ranging from various advertising related things, you can name them all, to Google Maps and Google Checkout and various other things like that. So I did all the Google public transport stuff. And while I was there, obviously I came across OKRs. Wasn't so impressed. Happy to explain that later on. Wasn't so impressed with OKRs at the time, but I learned about them and I found the management style quite engaging and good generally at Google. That's where most of my background came from. Couple of startups, and then I went to Amazon in Luxembourg, which is where I live now with my family, and learned a huge amount from Amazon about management generally and leadership and how Amazon works. And I find a lot of the stuff that I learned at Amazon is really transferable. Then in the last 5 to 6 years, I've been independent consulting. I've done some product consulting work. I've done some regular consulting. And primarily these days, I spend my time working with startup founders, usually growth stage startups from 50 to 500 people, often even down to 20 or 30 people sometimes, on management techniques and how to manage, and specifically around OKRs. And what I found is that a lot of the things that I learned at both Google and Amazon are really transferable, but they require adaptation. And so we adapt them to the particular scenario. If you try and do exactly what Google does, it works really well for a 150,000 person company who's been doing what they've been doing for 20 years and using the systems they've been using. But if you just try and copy that wholesale, it won't translate. So I work generally with people to sort of apply things that actually work to their organizations.
Cool. So Richard, you mentioned you're Australian originally. Where in Australia are you from?
I'm from Adelaide, which is where all the good wine in the world comes from. Basically,
we mean France?
A lot of. Sorry?
You mean France?
So it's interesting. Having moved over here to Europe, I started to get to know European wines, and initially with an Australian palate, European wines, including French wines, most of them tasted quite weak and just not very interesting. And then after having lived in Europe, UK and now Luxembourg for 20 years, I've adapted to the French palate, and now I have an Australian wine. It's like being hit over the head with a bat. Yeah. It's like, whoa, that's powerful. And I really quite like the French wines now as well. So I like both of them. But the area that I'm from is Adelaide, and that's where very close to most of the biggest wine producing districts in Australia.
Yeah, cool. No, the reason I'm asking is I've been to Australia several times, but I've never been to Adelaide. So Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, but also in the north in Darwin. So I haven't made it to Adelaide yet. Maybe next time, and then I'll try the wine and see whether it hits me in the head or not.
Yeah. I mean, Adelaide's not the world's biggest tourist attraction, but it is a lovely place to live.
Yeah, great. So let's dive into this. You mentioned already a few of the interesting topics that I want to explore with you, because And when I watch you on LinkedIn, you post a lot on OKRs. And I like the fact that you brought up in the introduction, you have been at these big corporations and now you're working mainly with startups or scale-ups. But
Yep.
I guess, and my assumption might be wrong, that you've also worked with some larger organizations that want to become more like a Google or like an Amazon and are looking for some of the practices to implement. And this is the focus of my intention today, is to look at, okay, what kind of practices, you mentioned OKRs already, did you observe at these organizations? And you mentioned that, interestingly, initially you didn't like OKRs that much, and we'll go into that. And then which of these practices can be really applied with slides or without adaptation, who knows, to both startups, but also, and this is where my primary focus is, established organizations with very long business models, and how can they make that shift or that move towards gaining back some more innovative edge, right? But let's start first with the practices you got to know. Let's start at Google, because OKRs you already mentioned. But what were the other things that you learned at Google? And with OKRs, what was the part that you didn't like that much?
Well, let me start with my experience of OKRs at the very beginning. When I joined Google, which was 2006, it was kind of my dream job. I've dreamed about it since I first read about the hiring policy and how they worked in 1998 or something like that. And so I joined Google in 2006 in London, and they had the onboarding process, and it was all very interesting. And then HR was doing the onboarding training, and they said, here's how to log expenses and your holidays and all that sort of stuff. And then here's our goal system. It's called OKRs. We think it's kind of special. Most companies have a goal setting system. This is ours. We think ours is special. And I looked at it and thought, well, okay, great. It's structured goals. You've got a heading, like the objective, like I simplified it, the heading, and some SMART goals, like the key results are basically SMART goals. And I was like, okay, cool. It sounds sensible, but it didn't really do a great deal for me. Now, what happened as I went through my 6 years at Google and I became a manager there, is I still didn't fall in love with OKRs. But what I did find is that the way that management worked at Google, there was a lot of discussion about what are we trying to actually achieve here? What's the purpose of what we're doing? Every group had their OKRs, and every team knew what they were trying to achieve. Every team could link their OKRs with the company OKRs or the division or the product product group OKRs that they were trying to work with. When you worked with other people, the first thing you'd say is, so what's on your OKRs? Like, as in, if we're going to work with something together, what are you trying to achieve? What am I trying to achieve? And are these things compatible? Because if they're not compatible, we're going to struggle to work together. If they are compatible, we've got a basis for collaboration. And so what I found is that the effect of this was really interesting, really valuable and worthwhile. And the second thing I found was that management tended to be quite keen on empowering people to solve the problems. And where I linked this together after I left, I sort of linked back, well, how did that happen? And a lot of that is because of the OKR system, what's at least structured around the OKR system, in that if you're very clear about what you want to achieve, your objective, and how do you define success, your key results, then it becomes relatively easy, and it's not trivial. You still have to do this as a manager, as a leader, but it becomes relatively easy to empower people to go and come up with solutions that do that. And then as a manager, you're actively involved in this, but you're getting people to sort of come up with new and interesting ideas to solve these kinds of problems. And that's where I found OKRs are really helpful, not as a replacement for management, but as a tool to structure good management around.
Yeah.
So it's it means that all the things you're doing, you're trying to achieve the same thing, you're trying to achieve something, and everyone understands what that is. So therefore it's easy to empower people.
Yeah. Now, it is interesting that one sentence that you said, it's not a replacement for management, but and I'm paraphrasing, ensures good management practices. Now, what would be those good management practices from your perspective that OKRs help you get to?
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest thing that I think is really going on here is that it's about empowering people and focusing them on the actual goal that you're trying to do. I mean, the best definition of management or leadership that I've ever come across is by a guy called Kevin Cruz. And he says that leadership is the social process of influence to maximize the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. And to do this, you have to know what your goal is. What are you trying to achieve? So when you talk about what are we doing here? It's all about what's the benefit here. It's not that you don't sort of set an OKR and then step back and magic happens. Not like you're not sort of defining these things. And a lot of people think no one vocalizes this, but in practice, what happens is people sort of spend a lot of time perfecting their OKRs and getting the perfect expression of what the OKR should be. And then they're not engaged as managers and as leaders to engage their people in solving the problem. And that's where it really comes down to. So this whole sort of like the rest of the good management is really about engaging people's brains, like you're engaging their full brains, not just on tasks and on doing things, and not just on like, we have a general guidance to make profit, but we're actually expressing our strategy into this. Here is the thing that we want to achieve this quarter. And now I can work with you as a leader and across functions to figure out how best to actually come and deliver that. And engaging your brain in doing so. So that's really the key thing, is the engaging people's brains in it. There's a series of other things there about actually making the strategy decisions. Yeah. That if you don't have a strategy, you don't know what you're trying to achieve, it's really hard to set an OKR. So the discipline of setting OKRs kind of causes you to go through the process of figuring out what your strategy is. And once you're doing that, certainly if they're the larger organization, in your larger organization, being able to do that from the top level and having that go through the organization really helps you make some of those key decisions that leaders need to make. That then means that people can engage in doing the work that matters.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I was talking to Christina Wodka almost a year ago about her book, Radical Focus. I'm sure you've read that book probably or know her somehow, right? And she's very strong on like, what are the prerequisites before you can even get to OKRs? But of course, having a strategy defined, which is actually actionable, that is one of the prerequisites. And then the OKRs help you make it more actionable, make it more measurable on a quarterly basis. But without that strategy, good luck defining good OKRs.
So here's an interesting thing that I found when you're working with the executive teams of the startups that I work with. Usually they don't have a strategy. Like usually they think they do. They have a slide deck that has 6 pillars and it has a roadmap and it has lots of beautiful slides that express something that they call a strategy. When it comes down to setting their OKRs, they can't decide what to do because their strategy isn't clear enough on what we should do. It's sort of like it's more like a list of levers, a list of options. And a roadmap. So what I do is but the thing is, as an outsider, this is one of the things that I've learned, especially having come from Google and Amazon. When I go to other companies and I just say, here's how we do it at Google and Amazon, it doesn't stick unless it really applies to them, has to be tuned to them. And the same thing happens with strategy. If I come in and say your strategy is not clear enough, who am I to tell them that? Like maybe I just don't understand their strategy and they think they understand their strategy. So we just have an argument and it doesn't help anybody. Whereas if we go through the process of like, okay, so what are you going to do and how these OKRs look? And then they realize that they can't make that decision, then it creates a pain that then they have to go back and figure out what their strategy is. So I actually use OKRs as a tool to cause people to realize that what they need to do about the strategy.
Yeah.
So Christine is right in that without a strategy, it's very hard to set OKRs. So do the strategy first. But in practice, so many people don't know how to do a strategy and they don't know that they need a strategy or what a strategy looks like. So we use the OKRs to create the pain so that then they can do the strategy.
Exactly, right? And also, I mean, you mentioned some of them believe they do have a strategy, but through going through the OKR setting, you create the awareness that, maybe we don't have a strategy that can actually be put into OKRs.
Yeah. I mean, it varies a bit. Sometimes they know, sometimes they don't. But
So let's go through a few other things. You mentioned like the good management practices that you learned at Google. You mentioned OKRs as a concrete thing that also helps to enforce good management practices. What else did you learn at Google and later at Amazon? Because Amazon has a ton of other management practices that they apply, and I believe can also be applied to some organizations. But let's first look at what those things are.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I will note, you mentioned there is that using OKRs to enforce. I don't think the OKRs actually work as a tool to enforce, but they do work as a tool to highlight and structure things.
Yeah,
so
better term.
Much more gentle than the forcing function. I do find that if you use it as a forcing function, it becomes a bit of the case of putting the cart before the horse. And people realize that, and then they object to OKRs because it's the thing that's forcing them to do stuff they don't want to do. Whereas if they feel the need to do those things that are good management, that can actually work better. But that's sort of by the by.
No, but I thank you for clarifying this. This is good. Thank you.
That's okay. I mean, it's just from my experience, as in when people start to feel like OKRs are are the thing that they're doing, then they're missing the point somewhere. So you're talking about what are the other techniques and so on that we have at Amazon and Google. So at Google, what I found about Google is that the management methods and approaches were not particularly mature, not particularly clear. We definitely they had this project called Project Oxygen. You probably come across it. It has a list of the characteristics of good managers. It's very, very good. It's very, very accurate and meaningful and transferable. It's all about engaging people and having a safe space and making sure that you're very clear about what you're trying to achieve. But it doesn't have methods that you can do. It has the definition of what good looks like, but then what do I do to make that happen?
Yeah, without a recipe on how to get there.
Yeah, what's the recipe and how exactly? What are the mechanisms or things that I should actually do to make things clear? I think I'm making things clear, but everyone says I'm not making things clear. What do I do? And so OKRs do help a bit with that, and some of these things do help a bit. But what I found is that Amazon has a much more mature management process, which really does work. Now, what they're missing is actually OKRs, ironically, in that their goal system is kind of really hard to navigate. It's really hard to understand what any team is doing and what they're trying to achieve and so on. You can't find it out. It's all secret. So they benefit from OKRs. But apart from that, they have a lot of really, really good management systems, and it's usually structured around writing. And this is something that I found is incredibly useful. And a lot of the commentary on writing, I know you've interviewed Colin Breyer recently, who wrote the Working Backwards book, and I like that book. I've got it up here. I don't have it up here because it's been lent to somebody recently. Who I've got to get it back from. But it's a good book. But one of the things that I found really interesting in my experience, that's the one. So one of the things that I've found very interesting in my experience is that a lot of the value of the writing exercise, there's two types of value that you get from it. One is the discipline of writing causes clarity, causes you to do the thinking, causes you to make sure it's really clear. That's really helpful as an individual, as doing something. It's helpful as an organization because now I get clarity on what someone's thinking, whatever that is. But the real benefit from this, especially in larger organizations, is in the review process, right? In getting people to review these documents and setting them backwards and forwards. Because what tends to happen in most larger organizations, this is where, I started teaching working backwards as a method a couple of years ago, especially to larger organizations. I did this with Nestle and Vodafone and Intuit and a few others, right? And what I found is that you write things down, it's very helpful, but what's really going on here is that getting other people engaged in this conversation about what the innovation is or what the problem we're trying to solve is and what the plan is the real challenge in a larger organization. If I'm ever in a situation, especially with a new idea, but even with a plan or a proposal or a problem-solving situation where I've got an idea that a solution that I want to sort of get through to people, almost every other mechanism involves some form of adversarial sort of conversation. Like if I do a presentation, it's me and my presentation trying to convince you of my opinion, right? And it's quite one way, and it creates an adversarial sort of thing where you then sit there and object, right? So that's the sort of standard way of doing things. And often workshops can work quite well, but they don't always have very structured outcomes. So with this document, you write it down. You might even be writing just a draft, like a straw man. Like we call them sort of the straw man document, which is written down in order for the purpose of tearing it apart. But now you and I would look at this document and we collaborate to make the document better. It's not my document that you're consuming, right? Necessarily, certainly in the earlier stages, we're collaborating together to figure out how do we make this better? How do we explore this idea better and come up with a better solution? And then what that means is that you're now part of the production of that idea, like that solution, that outcome is something that you're an equal owner of with me. Yeah. And now we're solving a lot of that collaboration problem within an organization.
So it builds collective ownership around.
Yeah, it builds collective ownership, builds momentum, and it extracts ideas from people as well. Like just by having a document that you and I are sort of sitting on the same table, on the same side of the table, even physically, working together on, you then find it easier to express your different ideas, and we integrate that into the document, or we figure out how to put it in there. Or I object, I don't like it, but we put it into an FAQ, so at least it's there, and now it's represented. And now you don't feel adversarial against me. You feel like I support this document because at least it captures my objections.
Yeah, absolutely.
That kind of thing. Now, so you just end up generating this sort of momentum and generating collaboration between teams.
Yeah. Now, this written narrative is one of the practices that is, my understanding, very strongly lived at Amazon. What other practices did you come across that you found particularly interesting? Because you mentioned that the management model at Amazon was much more mature than the one that you found at Google. Probably also due to timing, right? But also could be the type of the organization.
It is the type of organization. I mean, you think of the fundamental difference between the two companies. Google was set up by a couple of engineers who tried to make a place that's a wonderful place for engineers to work. So they hire smart people and make them happy, and give them good challenges and lots of freedom and hope that good things happen. Amazon was set up by a investment banker who wanted to make a very successful organization. So he hired workaholics and put structures in place to make them work hard. And lots of good things happen, and they happen to be smart people. And Google people are often hardworking people, but it's a very different culture. So Jeff sort of put in place all these systems. He believes in mechanisms, like how do you get a result? You need a mechanism that sort of, when we do this process or this thing, we have a document and we sit there and collaborate with it. The outcome is that we are now sharing the ownership of this document, and that's sort of the mechanism, if you like. So here's a whole series of these things. One of my favorites is the weekly business review. And I do find, and this is an interesting thing, that often people who do OKRs tend to try to use OKRs for everything and not use anything else. And I think this is a mistake. I think that there are many parts of a business where you really need a relatively large number of metrics to be tracked on a regular basis. And I don't necessarily have targets for all of them. I might have targets for a few. I might have OKRs for a few of them. But basically, I'm following the metrics that matter for my organization. And I use this in a weekly business review. So every week we look at all of the metrics that are relevant. And this might be of my function. It might be my product. It might be the whole business. It might be sales. It might be marketing. It might be across different groups, whatever it is, right? But you're looking at these together with a group of people that are committed to this project or this area. So with my clients, that's often the C team, the executive team. We sit down and we look at every week. Here are the main metrics, and we're having this conversation about, well, what's changed? You're not just having a dashboard. A lot of people have these beautiful dashboards with numbers on them, and it's like, cool, I can see a snapshot, but what's happening? And what you need is like the history of at least over a couple of months, usually a year, ideally a year plus the year before, so you can see seasonality, right? So you look at these numbers, whatever they are. They might be new leads, they might be page views, whatever's important to your business. You're looking at these numbers on a regular basis. You're seeing things change, and then you're able to react to them. And by doing this, you're, number one, starting to investigate what drives what in the organization. What are the leading metrics? With the leading metrics, you're never going to go and sit down for half an hour, brainstorm, and come up with the leading metrics. You have to actually work with the numbers and with this on a regular basis until you discover what really leads what drives what, and how does this really work, and how can I get an early signal? What are my inputs that I can control? And then how does this business really work? So by doing this and sitting down and going through these numbers, at Amazon, you'd have a deck of 20 pages with thousands of numbers on it, but you can do this a lot simpler. But by doing this on a regular basis, you start to get that team really engaged in understanding how this business works, which then means that I can come up with a strategy much better and my OKRs much better. But it also means that because I'm following these things on a regular basis, I'm able to react to changes in the business that have not been planned as part of my strategy, but something is happening. Like, suddenly one day we're having fewer impressions on our sales page. What's going on here? Let's have a look at it. Let's respond to this. And now that's a tool that I have for driving action in my organization that does not have to be associated with a specific OKR.
Okay.
So that's one of the things that I found incredibly useful.
Weekly business reviews is the term, right?
Weekly business review is the term that we used. It's basically a metrics deck. And I strongly recommend basically having an Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets with numbers on it. And if you really want to have a graph or two to make it so it's really clear, but you want historical numbers and historical graphs, not like a dashboard with like the current number.
Yeah. Okay. What else? You have a sip, and then what else?
So what else? So Amazon had a number of other things which were more the writing methods, which is basically the QBR, quarterly business review, and monthly business review. I found those to be really useful at Amazon. Less useful at smaller organizations because you just don't need that level of analysis and synthesis in a small organization. I mean, you need some of it, but some of it's really, really helpful. Working backwards itself was another writing tool that was basically about the idea. And where working backwards comes in, I know you've had Colin on the show before, so you've explored working backwards, but the fundamental idea about this is that you're collaborating on a document that explains how this product how a customer will encounter the product for the first time. And it's really about how I'm going to communicate the value of the product. And by doing so, I'm able to focus my efforts on the things that actually matter to the customer at that buying decision. Because especially in larger organizations, we tend to get obsessed with our own internal activities, whatever's going on. We tend to get obsessed with those things. We tend to get distracted by our technology, and then put our technology first. And this really forces the customer first. So then you got this, here's how it's going to matter to a customer. And you realize that this huge feature that I wanted to do, that we have the technology for, that I think is pretty cool, doesn't matter to customers. And so we don't invest in that. We don't waste our money on that. But then by having the document, we're then able to collaborate and get into this neutral space of customer as opposed to my idea. And so that's been really useful as well. So that would be another one. And then the last one that I think really comes up to me is the hiring method, which is kind of like a hiring and people method, right? The way that hiring, firing, rewards, promotions are done. And the fundamental concept here is when there's a definition of what the bar is, like what we're looking for in people. And we have specific cultural traits, the leadership principles, we have expectations for that, and we have a leveling system. Now, in large organizations, you always have some form of leveling system. But what you're really doing here is not just assessing people against the people already there, but you're assessing people against this abstract notion of the level, right? Of what capability they should have. And when you're assessing people based on stories of what they have done in the past. Like, the belief is that when you're interviewing people, past performance is actually a really good predictor of future performance, much better than hypotheticals. Google used to do a lot of hypothetical interviews, like problem solving, and you attract a lot of people who are great at problem solving, but not necessarily good at doing the work. And great at talking, not necessarily good at delivering. And so Amazon focuses on this like storytelling about what's your situation, task, action, response, or what the result rather. What did you do? And you ask these questions about how have you done something in relate, that you have a question that sort of drives people down the path of like, when have you dug deep into a problem? You get dug deeper and deeper into a problem. Just tell me about that situation. And now I can ask you about what happened. And if you're the person who dives deep into problems, then I'll understand this from that background and I'll know this. But this whole thing sort of maps not just to hiring, but also to how promotions work as well. So when you're doing a performance assessment or a promotion assessment as a manager, you need to sort of say, here at a level 6 or a level 5 or a level 7, this is what I expect and this is what the person has done. And by doing so, you're articulating, first of all, what my understanding of the abstract notion of the level is, and then I'm articulating what the other person is. But because we have this abstract notion and we talk about it all the time, and it's part of every performance review, every hiring review, every promotion review, and every firing situation, because we're talking about that all the time, we have a very clear understanding of what being a level 6 engineer or a level 7 senior manager of product means, right? And that then defines very much the behaviors that you really need in the organization. So it means that that's very consistent, because all of these cultural things, we talk about culture a lot. The only way culture happens is if it's really part of that hiring, firing, reward, and promotion system. Yeah. That's the only way it actually sticks. If people see that actually happening in real life and decisions really being made based on this and promotions really made based on this, then that culture will stick. If it's not, then it's just words.
Exactly. Then it's just words on a poster and nobody cares about it anyway. Actually, they laugh about it because they know it doesn't count at all. Now, you mentioned a few things, right? We started at Google. You talked about OKRs, then helping to get to good management practices and raising awareness of what good management practices would be. You talked at Amazon about the written narrative, the weekly business review, the working backwards process in itself, right? Starting out with customers, and connected to that is number one leadership principle, which is customer obsession. And then you talked about the hiring piece, which they also have a concrete practice, or a role, which is the bar raiser, right?
Yeah.
Now, I want to talk, before we go into looking at what can be taken from these organizations and applied both to scale-ups, but also established ones, is talking about the role of leadership in general. Because I am mainly from, let's say, like the Agile community, right? And there are different communities out there. I identify with that community. I've been part of that. And one of the key conversations or discussions I had with many people across the years is like, what is the role of leadership or management in organizations in the future if they want to be more innovative, more agile, more responsive to market changes? And even before that, is there even a role like a manager or not? My take has always been, if I look at the organizations that are referred to as great case studies, be it Amazon, Google, Tesla, whoever, they all have management in place.
Yeah.
And for me, the question becomes not if there is management, but it's rather what does management do differently? And I wanted to take your perspective on, or get your perspective on this, because you have worked in two of these phenomenal organizations, and you can speak from firsthand, and not only from what people read in books or case studies.
So one of the things that that tends to come out, especially in my introductions to the Agile community, is there's a thing that goes on that people think where we have a self-managing team, therefore we don't need management. And I find that a really destructive concept. Not because self-management's a bad idea. I think self-management's a good idea. Self-managing teams are great, and that's what you need. But what's really going on here is that this is taking the micromanaging that people used to do and getting rid of it and making sure that people are managing themselves in that sort of like organizing the work that I'm doing sort of thing. What that means, though, is that the role of manager, and this is where there's a couple of books you have and I have here by Marty Kagan, and one of them is
Empowered.
Not inspired, empowered, and he talks in this book in particular about this kind of empowered team doesn't require less management; it requires better management, right? Yes. And what's going on here is really interesting, because what you need is, if you look at the Netflix model, it's really about management's about making sure that you're giving the right pieces of context and synthesizing across organizations. There is no matter how you organize this, when you have a large group of people, there's not enough. Not every person can understand everything that's going on, and not every person will be aligned. Like people will pull in different directions no matter what you do, and they'll have different understandings and different contexts. So the role of management is really to ensure that we get the right pieces of information and the right decisions, and that those decisions happen at the right places. Right? Sometimes that means pushing the decisions down. Sometimes it means pulling the decisions up to make sure that they happen in a coordinated fashion. Right? And so hence we get people aligned and actually doing things together. And what I find really interesting, often when you look at large organizations, and I remember, especially as a junior, I used to look at senior managers and executives and CEOs and things like that and think, I could do those jobs. Those decisions are not particularly hard. Because in many ways, they're not. Like in many cases, they're not actually that hard. And you can look at the decisions they're making and critique them, and we can be armchair managers and sit back and say you're doing all the wrong things. Look at Tim Cook doing this. Look at Zuckerberg doing that. But the realistic what's going on here is that the hard part is not actually making the decision. It's getting a large number of highly motivated, highly intelligent, really lots of context people going in the same direction, whatever that direction is. I mean, you have to decide on the direction, but every decision is going to have people who like that decision and don't like that decision. Right. And every decision, like especially in a strategy situation, you're doing something that might disrupt your core business. As a leader, you need, especially at the senior level, you need to manage that and somehow get these people going in the same direction so that they don't fight each other. And if you look at most organizations, my experience of especially large organizations, but even medium to small ones, so much energy goes into internal politics and internal debates, and those people are trying to fight against these people. And if only customer service would do the right thing, then we'd all be successful here. Right. And that's the work of management, is to really, like, that's the core, the fundamental work of management is to make sure that isn't the problem, that problem goes away and is coordinated so that everyone has got their attention on the customer and on delivering the strategy and on delivering value to the customer. And we're putting some of our personal ambitions and our team ambitions behind us and focusing on how do we do things that work for the whole company, which means making trade-offs that some individuals are going to find very difficult. So I don't know whether that answers the question perfectly well.
It does. First of all, it answers the question. Like all of these organizations that many people refer to, they do have management in place. And sometimes, they have various levels of management in place. It's not like they don't have the VPs and the SVPs and whatever, right? They do have all of that. So this flat organization that a lot of people are dreaming about, especially in the Agile community, I've never seen it anywhere, right? Yeah. In no company that I refer to. What I've seen are self-managing teams. And as Marty Kagan points out, and you referenced him, right? It's not about having less management. It's about having better management. And this connects really well to the topic you mentioned earlier at Google, right? How OKRs help to get to better management. And then the question becomes, what is this better management? And you mentioned Netflix as well. And I love this concept that they have about the informed captains who take decisions, right? They don't take all the decisions, but you want them to take more and more decisions. And if you combine that, for example, now we're going into a lot of different practices, right, from different companies with the type 1, type 2 decision making from Amazon, where you clearly distinguish between, okay, what kind of decision needs to be taken at the very top? And speed is not the most important thing for that decision. It's more about taking it in very deliberately. Whereas what kind of decisions should be taken fast And
Yeah.
then we need to inspect and adapt on those. And then creating the right environment so that everyone knows which decision we're talking about. And those who should take the decisions are actually capable of taking those decisions. That becomes the role of management from my perspective. And it very closely connects to what you've been sharing earlier about this like social process of influencing people towards going towards the same goal, right?
Maximize.
So this is, I think, the part where a lot of organizations, but also a lot of coaches and consultants, they need to take a bit more of a realistic stance. Because if we are referencing to companies like Amazon, we should really reference to a company like Amazon and not take some of those practices and then put them into a completely different context where they haven't been proven. That's at least my perspective.
Yeah, I think a lot of the ways to take learnings from companies like Amazon and Google is not to duplicate the processes, because that doesn't always work. Especially like, Google has 20 years of doing OKRs. They do it in what I consider a relatively heavyweight, complex way, but it's 20 years of doing this with 150,000 people, right? Amazon has a really heavy process for writing documents. I remember writing a document that was to be reviewed by a few of them for VPs or SVPs, and even the CEO of Amazon Commerce at the time, a guy called Andy, not Jesse, it was Jeff Wilkie.
Jeff Wilkie, yeah.
And so I wrote these documents, and it would take weeks and weeks and revisions from multiple directors and multiple people putting input to it and reviewing it and so on. And it's so much effort to get this document that then he spends 2 hours on, right? And it's a really costly document. That document is worth tens of thousands of dollars, right? Because of how expensive it is. Now, if you just duplicate that practice into another organization without having the sort of like the rest of the culture associated with that, it's not really going to fly very well, because people aren't willing to spend that amount of time on it. People don't make decisions like that. It's a very long and slow process to change things to be a bit more like that. And so the organizations where I've seen where this has happened have been places where senior management has had that interest in doing so, and they've slowly raised the bar of like what a good document is, and they're slowly raising it to a point where, okay, now we're having a really good conversation here. The document still wouldn't pass muster at Amazon, but it's actually really adding value in our context, in our organization. And I have one customer who's only 30 people, and they write documents. And the way that they do this is basically by making sure that they're getting something down, and it's a straw man document. It's got my thinking in there, but it's not polished. I've put an hour or two into it, but now we can have a conversation about the document. And now we get a good conversation, and it doesn't have to be a polished document because it's not going to Jeff Wilkie, right? Yeah. So a lot of these things, like the trick is not to simply duplicate the system, but to figure out what's the principle at work here, and how do I apply that principle to my specific problems. Because there's two things going on. One is like, if you duplicate it, that doesn't work. And the other one is that if you don't have a need to solve a problem, it doesn't matter whether the system works or not. It doesn't matter. That solution doesn't matter to you, right? Mm-hmm. So whenever I talk to customers about OKRs, like someone says, we'd like to do OKRs, I say, well, why? What are you trying to solve here, right? I usually start the whole process with a discovery process of understanding from all of the leaders what their problems are, what they're trying to solve. And 99% of the time, there are other things that they need to do as well. So that's why we do things on metrics and on KPIs or metric stacks and other things. But sometimes it's literally like the reason to do OKRs is because I read a book and I thought it sounded awesome and I think we should do that. And Google's successful and we should do what they do. Yeah. So that's not going to get you anywhere, right? You've got the wrong expectation. You don't have the right motivation, which, you're going to run out of steam. But just by the time we're getting started, you're going to run out of motivation to do this because you don't have a need. And so the same thing goes for the writing processes, for working backwards, for whatever it is. If you have a need and this solves the need and you can take the principle and apply it within your context, great. If you don't actually have a need, then don't do that. Do something else.
And it's absolutely, I fully agree with you. When I was talking to Colin, this was one of the points that he brought up. He was like, the Amazon operating system did not just suddenly emerge. Yeah. Even within Amazon, it was always based on a problem that they were facing and then several things that they tried. Yeah. And it's like product development. You need to identify what your customers' pain points are and then build features, whatever, to address those pain points. Some of the features that you build are not going to fix anything. Some are going to stick. And then all right, let's build on top of that, right? But it's always, again, even the working backwards process of starting out with the customer can be applied to developing an organization, right? Starting out with the employees, starting out with the leadership team. What problem are they facing? And now there are different ideas that we can take from different organizations to test them in a different manner. You referred to the written narrative. I recently started within my organization to apply that written narrative. Did I ask them to write 6 pages? No. I just gave them 5 questions, which I want to be answered as part of a pitch or an idea that we should pursue. And it helps them to structure their own thinking. Now, once it's out there, everybody else can chime in. They can build on top of that. They can critique some aspects of it. And it creates a completely different level of engagement. And for me, the problem that I wanted to solve was everybody would reach out to me, and then I would have to update everybody else in the organization. Now, can I create an environment where everyone is from day one involved whenever these ideas come up? And the written narrative seemed to be a good solution to that. We're trying it. So far, it seems to be working out well. Feedback has been good. But maybe we get to something else. But it's always based on a concrete problem to solve.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of my clients, we recently introduced a particular type of written narrative, which is the plan. So we set the OKRs, and then you got to write down a plan of like how we're going to go about delivering this. And some of us, I have something of an agile background as well. There's in some agile cultures, there's a resistance to planning. We don't plan and we don't do deadlines. I don't think that's true in agile, but that's the way a lot of people view these things. But I find that with the plan, people either tend to overcomplicate it and do this perfected 16-page, highly polished, huge effort plan, which is then no one uses again because it's just too complicated to touch. Or else people have plan, I've got a plan, and then they rattle off some things. This is my cowboy method. Rattle off some things, and then the next week, so how's it going with the plan? Plan? What plan? That plan, yes. And they rattle off some other things, and it's a different thing, right? Because if you're quick at thinking on your feet, you can think of the plan at any particular point in time. So what I got these guys doing was like, okay, we'll write down a plan onto a piece of, like I have a 1-page plan template. It's actually used in 2 or 3 pages, but aspirationally 1 page. And it basically just says, what are you going to do? What are the big things? What are the small things? What are the business as usual things that you're going to keep doing? What resources do you need for this? What are you not going to do? And, what are the risks? What are the projections? And it's just some simple stuff. And so one guy spent 25 minutes writing his plan before the meeting that we came to. He's just like, I'll write that down. So he did a bunch of stuff and wrote it down kind of top of the head. We had a discussion about this because this was an executive team. He was the head of business development or sales. And everyone reviewed this plan and was like challenging him on, well, why are we doing this? Would we do that? Were you missing this part? And we had a really constructive conversation about what he's planning to do for the quarter. So then he was able to update this and change it. And lots of learnings came out of this for the rest of the people about how they can write their plans, what they need to do. Oh, I need to coordinate with sales guy on this topic, on the sales team on that topic, because it's in their plan and I need to work with them on that. And now I know because it's written there. And so it really did actually address a bunch of issues. And it was really visible as soon as he wrote it down and people read it. We just got all these comments, and it was a 25-minute document. If he'd put 3 hours or 6 hours or 6 days or weeks into it, it would have been far too complicated for anyone to digest and long, and then no one would want to adjust it or critique it or criticize it, because he's put so much into it. 25 minutes, it's really valuable.
Absolutely. Now, we have around 15 minutes left based on the time box that we set up, Richard. And I want to use now the remainder time to actually go into the topic of OKRs, because it came up several times. Yeah, and sure. I know that you are very much focused on that topic, especially, and you mentioned it yourself, when you work with scale-ups and even larger organizations. Yeah. Now, when you talk about the topic of OKRs, you already mentioned it. It's identifying where do we want to go, right? That's the objective. And how do we know whether we're getting in that direction, which is the key results, which is much more tangible. Now, when you start with an organization to think about and then implement OKRs, what are the steps that you take? And where do you think organizations should be very cautious?
Sure. So, I mean, I've had a couple of my interactions with smaller companies. One of the reasons I work with smaller companies is because I'm working with the CEO and the C team, and it means that we have full scope to change things. So within that group, there's very few sacred cows, and they can change the things that they need to change. Some things are harder than others to change, some things they don't want to change, but at least we can talk about these things and change them. In most large organizations where I've really struggled working with them, like I've worked with a few large organizations, including a 100,000 person Fortune company, and I worked with the IT department of about 1,000 people. They struggle because they don't have control over some of the key elements. Like they're getting direction from above that's ambiguous, or there's not a clear strategy. There's not a clear expectation of what success looks like for their team, and they don't know what the expectation is, or their bonuses are hardwired into achieving particular smart targets, which are counterproductive. And so that's like, well, if you're doing that, that's always going to dictate your behavior. And how do you go beyond that when that's what your compensation structure is? If you have a bonus structure or incentive structure that derives particular performance on particular things, that's always going to be more to people than any form of goal setting system apart that doesn't have compensation attached to it. So we have this challenge. So one of the things that I find is that if you're going to do OKRs in a larger organization, I'll talk about this briefly because that's your area. Number one, the ideal situation is to start with as much, or either a group or a team or a business unit, or ideally the top, where there's as much autonomy as possible, right? If you're a service function within an organization, it's actually really hard to do, this IT department being case in point, because most of the business is providing service to other people and you have very little control over your own strategy, right? You have so many stakeholders, there's so many expectations around the place. Those are the things that matter far more. And then you're kind of being buffeted by a lot of that. So if I was to start out somewhere, you want to start out with a business unit or a project team that is relatively self-contained. The fewer dependencies and interactions with the rest of the organization, the more likely that's actually going to work in there. Because then you can control most of the issues. You can have those decisions and have those discussions about what are we trying to do, and you can make a decision and then put it into, put that decision into the OKR. Whereas otherwise, if you're in an organization where realistically to get approval of anything we do, we have to go 7 levels up, it just becomes really difficult, because then you've got to get them to understand what an OKR is. However, if you're going to do this within any organization, wherever you are, whether it's a relatively autonomous group or a non-autonomous group, and you still want to use them, the one challenge that I think exists that is unique to that situation, or is particularly acute to that situation, is being really careful with anything approaching a stretch target, a stretch goal. And OKRs, a lot of people sort of have this thing about, because Google says you should aim for 70%, that's considered success. Therefore, that's what an OKR must be. And I don't think that's the case. I think with an OKR, you can decide to have a stretch goal. You can decide to have a fully committed goal. You can decide to have a realistic target. Often in Europe, actually culturally, people in Europe tend to prefer to have targets that are more realistic, whereas Americans culturally tend to be more comfortable, at least as long as it's not associated with performance reviews. They tend to be more comfortable with ambitious targets that they may or may not hit. But whatever it is, you put down whatever you have there. But when you're communicating your OKRs to external people, to external to your organization who do not have the culture of stretched goals, you can only communicate committed goals, because that's how they will interpret them anyway. Right. And this is the thing that you have to, as soon as you say we have a moonshot target or a stretch target for this, it doesn't really matter what you do or what you say, somebody's going to hold you to it. And then somewhere along the line, there'll be a consequence for not having achieved this thing that you said you want, you may or may not achieve. And it's one of those things that's really, in organizations, it's really hard to avoid, because this happens with managers. It happens with HR systems. It happens with compensation systems, but it also happens with stakeholders across functions around the place. Like people just take a number and then we'll commit to that. And now we're stuck on that. So same thing in Agile and Scrum and so on, where you say there are certain things we don't want to commit to. You can't, in project management, you have the project management triangle. So you can't commit to all 3 of them. We have to keep at least one of them flexible, right? And as soon as you say something about one of them, if you say something about we'll deliver this by a deadline, that becomes your noose.
Yeah, that's how you're going to get measured, right?
Exactly.
That's how you're going to get measured. Okay, so now let's move from these larger organizations that I'm very thankful, brought up because of my area of work. What do you do now when you're working with a startup, when you work or a scale up, when you're working with the C-level, where they do have a lot of autonomy, right, around especially the objective? What are the next steps that you take?
So this is interesting, guys. It's like initially I used to sort of we do the training and then we go straight into let's set OKRs. Now, then what I did is I figured, okay, we need to do some discovery first. This is my own journey. Do some discovery to figure out what the real pain points are, so that we know how we can set these objectives that are relevant to their pains. But what I found when I was doing this, and this is, I'm sort of taking you through the journey that I had here. What I found when I was doing this is that often enough they'd struggle to set the OKRs in the first place. So what I now do is spend some time not only understanding the pain points and so on. Once I've understood the pain points, I filter that through a sort of lens of strategy. And so then I can ask some questions about what the strategy is, so that before we go and set the OKRs, because that's what you need to be able to set the OKRs. So I can ask these questions, and I've learned ways of sort of provoking the difficult decisions and the difficult questions about the strategy to cause clarity around the strategy before we go into the OKR setting process. And the tools that I use for that are basically Richard Rumelt's book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and
it's behind you.
Crux. Yes, I've got Crux. There it is. The striped, the triangle one. But yeah, so that book is really good, and it's about what a strategy looks like, and then the crux is kind of a lot more about how to go about setting it. So by asking these questions about what is the real thing and which ones would you trade off, and just sort of pressure testing some of the strategy questions that they've had, and what are you trading off in order to do that? We're going to have only 3 objectives, so maximum. This is one of the rules of OKRs that I'm actually really happy to break, but it's a really useful rule. And so you're going to have maximum of 3 objectives. Well, what are those 3 things going to be? Like, how do you look at your strategy, which has 7 pillars and a massive roadmap? What are the 3 things that really matter this quarter? Like, how do we even start with that? And so we're basically prefacing this OKR setting discussion by making sure we're spending some time on the strategy. So my last couple of clients, we've actually done a strategy workshop, and it's only been a couple of hours, but in that couple of hours, we've managed to pull out a story that is actually quite clear about what they want to do. And then setting the objectives becomes more a matter of like, okay, let's just align on exactly what that means in practice and what that means now. And it becomes a lot easier. So that's what we tend to do, is basically I'll go through that. What is the problem that you're trying to solve in your strategy? So we've done the discovery. So I know I usually have some idea of what the strategic problem is, but it's like, what is the problem? If you can't clarify amongst your team what the problem is that you're trying to solve, what your challenge in your strategy is, then you're not going to have a strategy. And then what are you going to do about it? What's your general approach? That's the sort of center of your strategy. And then what does that mean for actions? Like, what are the main things you're going to do, and in which kind of order are you going to do them in? You can't just have pillars. You need to say, we're going to do this one first, and then these 2, or whatever we're going to do. What are you going to do? And what are you trading off to do that? And what are the decisions you're going to make? We're going to stop doing this so that we can do that. Okay, good. Now we've got some decisions, and that becomes the right input for the OKRs.
Okay. So now we have this topic of strategy. We talked about that a bit earlier as well, right? How important that is, and how OKRs can also raise the awareness that you don't have a proper strategy yet. When you're now going into a first OKR cycle with a team, right, which is usually 3 months, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep.
Now, how do you approach this very first OKR cycle? Because they don't have any experience yet, right? You talked about stretch goals, which is an important topic, especially in Europe. Now, when they're setting those goals for the first time in a quarter or for the first cycle, they have no clue what would be a stretch or what can be committed. I look at this very similar to a Scrum team embarking on their first sprint. Yep. During sprint planning, they usually don't have any idea what they can do within 1 week, 2 weeks, or 4 weeks. Yeah. So how do you address that challenge with them?
The biggest thing is actually recognizing that you don't know, right? And setting the expectation up front that this will help you. This will help you focus and help you get the right result. But what you want to be focusing on is this helping you focus, as opposed to, am I able to correctly predict the outcome? Right? So you've got to get people away from this idea that my goals must be green and I must succeed in hitting those goals. What matters is, am I doing the best I can given the situation that I have and what I know and what we can deliver? And if that turns out to be a lot less than what we thought, it is what it is. This is reality. You need to deal with that. And then you need to go through the learning process of like, what is realistic and how do we make better decisions going forwards? So the biggest thing is actually the expectation setting process. The second thing, this is also, by the way, why it's really challenging in a larger organization, because those expectations are much more ingrained in the organization. But it happens in smaller organizations as well. I mean, I had one client, for example, reasonably large, like 400 or 500 people, and the CFO really wanted their OKRs to be directly linked to their P&L. So if we hit these OKRs, tick, 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 then our P&L will be all green, right, or all black, right? Whatever, it'll be good, right?
Not red, black.
We'll hit our financial targets for the quarter. And I said, well, what you need to do here is figure out what the strategy is, what you're going to do, that you're going to do it, and take the risk that you have a strategy, and then figure out how you can execute the strategy, and make sure the OKRs are going to help you execute the strategy. If your strategy is wrong, or if you can't execute it, you need to know where the problem is, and the link might well be that you've successfully achieved the goals, but it hasn't delivered the profits. Therefore, your strategy is wrong, right? Or therefore your projections are wrong, whatever it is. Or it might be that you haven't actually been able to deliver this because you've got the wrong expectations, but at least we know what to do about this. And as managers, we're sort of trying to understand, where do we change things? And if she just says, we need to hit all of these financial goals because that'll give us our output, all we're really doing here is delegating all of that strategy decision-making and all that prioritization work to a large number of people with different goals and hoping that they come up with a good answer. And that's abdication of management. Right. So that was one thing that happens there. I don't know. I feel like I've just gone on a tangent, by the way. I have a feel, but it just seemed really relevant to some of this, because I think that that one of the things that we do about, that's we're talking about, you can't predict things. Getting used to the fact that you can't predict it, and that's reality, and that's okay. You just need to be able to act in the best way you can given what's going on is really important. The second thing, though, so setting that up as a cycle, Agile and Lean often have this sort of cycle of, like, you do a retrospective and you figure out, what did I learn from this? And just setting up that learning cycle in the management structure is really, really helpful for that. But then the other thing is that when you're setting the OKR, you start doing some planning, and you use this planning document. So I get people doing the one-page plan at the same time as they're setting their OKR. And that kind of means that we do have some understanding of what we can do. And by having it disciplined to be brief as opposed to a 16-page monstrosity, it's like a 3-page brief thing. We get just the basics. We're not overanalyzing things. We're not sort of planning things out and micromanaging stuff. We're just getting, like, here's the basic idea of what we're going to do. And now that you've got some structure behind that, having other people, because different people in the management team will have different strengths and skills, but having other people have a look at this. When engineering leader looks at marketing's plan, number one, they learn about marketing, but number two, they'll have some different skills and different capabilities and different understandings and even different solutions, and will be able to help that plan become better. And so you're getting this collective brains trust of the organization to improve the planning and improve the execution and make sure we're sort of all owning this. And then overall, we can hit the goals. We hope we can hit the goals. We have a better chance of doing so by putting that effort in and making sure those conversations are happening at that level.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a few very important things. Like, first of all, accepting that you can't predict the future, really, right? The future is going to be written, but somehow, right, as we get there. And then you connected this really well to also something that Christina Wotka mentioned several times, which is OKRs as a system for an organization to learn. Yeah. And not only to learn on how to better set goals, which in itself is valuable, because the better you become at predicting what your organization is able to deliver, right? Predictability is great for your customers, for yourself, right? But you also learn what is working and what is not working, right? Yeah. Is it our delivery that's not working, or is it the actual plan that is not working, the strategy that is not working? And once you learn, like, if we do things this way, then we can impact our P&L or whatever in a certain manner. Then you become better at, like, coming up with new initiatives that then hopefully have better outcomes for you along the way. And I think a lot of organizations where I've seen OKRs being implemented, they do the strategy part, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. They go and define objectives, which is good. They define key results. I think sometimes too many objectives and too many key results, which again results in people losing their focus. But what they don't do, and this is very similar to teams applying Scrum, is they don't do the inspect and adapt. And for me, that's always the really important piece, right? We've had all of our assumptions. We've done our work. Now let's do inspect and adapt. And the same, I think, applies to OKRs. How do you see that, Richard?
Well, so I agree entirely, but one of the things that happens with inspect and adapt is that it's often one of the hardest things for people to do, because it involves a growth mindset, and it involves facing up to the fact that you're not perfect and you've made mistakes, and it involves revealing these mistakes to your peers. and in this team, right? So what's going on here is that you need to have a safe environment where that actually works, and where we're a team and we trust each other and we're all working towards building the best outcome. And the fact that you're not very good at planning is just part of what's going on here. And now we got to help you become better at planning, and you've got to face up to that, right? And this has been, on a personal level, really hard for me, even as an individual. Like, it's really hard to go through that process of like realizing the things that I'm not good at, and facing up to them, and being open about them with my wife or with my business partners, with various people that I work with, to figure out, how do I improve that, or how do I avoid that? How do we, as an organization, account for the fact that I'm not very good at certain things and that I am good at other things, and so as a group, as a team, if you have an executive team, there's often people, especially at the executive level, have had a history of success. That's how they got there. And so in some ways, many of them are not used to failure, and they're not used to dealing with that. They're not used to not succeeding. They're not used to not being perfect and being told you're doing a great job, because that's what's happened in my career. That's how I became CFO or whatever I am, right? And so that's the thing that you need to then sort of help people get to the point of like, it doesn't matter. Let's focus on the actual work and the reality, and how do we go better and how do we improve. And so this discipline is a really important discipline, but it does require, as a fundamental, as a foundation, this level of trust and care for each other as humans in this organization. Because if you're ever in a situation where you think you're going to get lambasted by a colleague or a manager or someone for not succeeding at doing something particular, then what happens is you hide that failure, or you hide that problem. And now we don't deal with that problem. And now we have that problem growing bigger and bigger, and we're not getting better, and we can't learn. So it's you have to have this cultural thing is really interesting. I found that it's one of those soft skills or soft topics of psychological safety and all that sort of topic. But what's really going on here is like, how do I make sure that we're in a place where you can fail and we can help you, and you'll be proactive about being helped.
Where a growth mindset is encouraged and not diminished, right? Exactly. So I think, Richard, this is, we could go on for hours. I really enjoy the conversation with you, but we're at the end of our time box. I want to use this opportunity again to thank you for taking the time, sharing your expertise, your experience working at such tremendous organizations, but then also the work that you're currently doing, helping other organizations build a bit more maturity into their management practices by learning from the good ones, but not copying things one by one, and always looking at problems to solve and then adapting based on how it works for them. So thank you for that. I'm sure you and I are going to speak again. Yeah. And any last words from your side?
Nothing springs to mind right now.
Nothing. Do you have anything to add?
I feel like I should have something profound that leaves people with a good taste in their mouths, but not really high.
No, I think you mentioned so many profound things throughout our conversation, so people should leave with a lot of inspiration. Thank you so much, Richard, again.
Excellent. Thank you, Sohrab.